Morning, everyone. Awesome. That was some good teamwork there with lifting the lectern. I enjoyed watching that. That was great. Morning, everyone. It's so good to be with you this morning. It's really nice to see some of your faces here, because last time I was preaching, it was very bizarre. It was an empty room, and there was just a camera at the back. So that was a bit of a different experience. We're in the middle of lockdown, so it's really good to see some of you here today. And also, thank you so much for joining us online as well. It's just really good to be here. So I'm really excited to be sharing with you on the next part of our Moses series that we've been going through over the last few weeks. But before I do that, I just want to do a quick poll. So hands up, or you can let us know in the YouTube chat. Who has used this Moses series just as a great excuse to rewatch the animated DreamWorks film, The Prince of Egypt? Oh, I see some legends over here. Right, that's not enough hands, guys. So it's Sunday, you've got the afternoon, so that's something to put on your to-do list. Go home, rewatch, or watch for the first time The Prince of Egypt. Absolute classic film. So I'm not going to be focusing too much more on that. I'm actually going to be looking at the Bible today, because that's what we really want to be talking about. And we're going to be looking at the book of Exodus and kind of going through the next bit of Moses' journey with the Israelites. So before we dive in, I thought I'd just do a quick recap of the story where we're up to so far. So at the start of the series, we joined Moses, where he has an incredible encounter with God at the burning bush. And God gives him this mission to speak truth to power, to go to Pharaoh, who's the ruler of Egypt, and one of the world's largest superpowers at the time. And he is called by God to say to Pharaoh to let the Israelites go, so the oppressed and enslaved Israelites to be freed. Now, understandably, Moses had some reservations about this mission, which Harry so helpfully unpacked for us a few weeks ago. But through God's power and might and strength and faithfulness, actually, eventually Moses was successful, and he was able to lead the Israelite people out of Egypt, across the Red Sea, which God miraculously parted for them. And that kind of brings us up to where we are in our story today, where the Israelites have left Egypt. And actually, we see that they have an incredible encounter with God, which is what I'm going to unpack a little bit more. So that's where we're up to, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to invite the lovely Phoebe, who we've already heard from this morning, and she's just going to read the passages for us. So Phoebe, if you could do that, that'd be brilliant.
So we're reading from Exodus 19, verse 1 through to verse 19. On the first day of the third month after the Israelites left Egypt, on that very day, they came to the desert of Sinai. After they set out from the Rephidim, they entered the desert of Sinai, and Israel camped there in the desert in front of the mountain. Then Moses went up to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain and said, "This is what you are to say to the descendants of Jacob, and what you are to tell the people of Israel. You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt, and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possessions. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words you are to speak to the Israelites." So Moses went back and summoned the elders of the people and set before them all the words of the Lord had commanded him to speak. The people all responded together, "We will do everything the Lord has said." So Moses brought their answer back to the Lord. The Lord said to Moses, "I am going to come to you in a dense cloud, so that the people will hear me speaking with you and will always put their trust in you." Then Moses told the Lord what the people had said. And the Lord said to Moses, "Go to the people and consecrate them today and tomorrow. Have them wash their clothes and be ready by the third day, because on that day the Lord will come down on Mount Sinai in the sight of all the people. Put limits for the people around the mountain and tell them, 'Be careful that you do not approach the mountain or touch the foot of it. Whoever touches the mountain is to be put to death. They are to be stoned or shot with arrows. Not a hand is to be laid on them. No person or animal shall be permitted to live. Only when the ram's horn sounds a long blast may they approach the mountain. After Moses had gone down the mountain to the people, he consecrated them, and they washed their clothes. Then he said to the people, "Prepare yourselves for the third day. Abstain from sexual relations." On the morning of the third day, there was thunder and lightning, with a thick cloud over the mountain and a very loud trumpet blast. Everyone in the camp trembled. Then Moses led the people out of the camp to meet with God, and they stood at the foot of the mountain. Mount Sinai was covered with smoke, because the Lord descended on it in fire. The smoke billowed up from it like smoke from a furnace, and the whole mountain trembled violently. As the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder, Moses spoke, and the voice of God answered him. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Phoebe. It's great to get someone else to read the Bible for you because you don't have to try and pronounce all the hard to pronounce places. So I think Phoebe did a great job there. Brilliant. So in this passage, what we see is a story of God revealing himself to his people. And God is making a binding promise with Israel and with the Israelites, or as it's called in the Bible, we call it a covenant. And what he's saying is that he will be their God and they will be his people. So what I want to focus on in these passages today is that I think they reveal something of the complexity and actually the amazingness of God's character and tell us something about what he's like. So I don't know if you can relate to this, or I know from my own experience and from kind of looking at the world around us, I think where there is complexity, there's often also misunderstanding. And I think that's something that we can definitely fall into the trap of when we think about God and his character, and when we try to understand God. So when we look at these passages and ask this question of what is God like, what would our answer be? We read in chapter 19, verse 12, that God tells Moses to say to the Israelites, "Be careful that you do not approach the mountain or touch the foot of it. Whoever touches the mountain is to be put to death." I don't know about you, but when I read that, I was like, okay, that's quite intense. That was my first response and reaction to those verses, and obviously it goes on to explain that and unpack that a little bit more. It's as I was chatting with my dad, we were saying it's not a verse that you tend to kind of put on your fridge. It's not really one that I've got framed up around the house. But to be fair, we have just moved into a new home, so if anyone would like to get us that as a housewarming gift, I think potentially could be a good conversation starter when friends come around. So it's quite an intense verse that we read there. But what does that mean about God's character when we read that? What is his character like if the Israelites can't even approach the area where his presence is without facing death? Maybe our immediate answer or thoughts would be that he's an angry God, or that he's scary and unapproachable, quite literally. Maybe we'd think that it means that he's harsh or mean, or maybe even cruel. Maybe that's how we or others would answer that question of what is God like? Or maybe that's, your experience of what you think God is like. Or perhaps your experience is a little bit different, and maybe you see God, or fall into seeing God sometimes as more of kind of a super on-call personal assistant who is there to use his power and wisdom to kind of make our lives better and help us live our best lives. Or, as the passage says, to carry us on eagle wings to whatever destination we fancy. Now, as I've said before, where there's complexity, there's often misunderstanding. And I think those are two of the misunderstandings that sometimes we can have about God, or that we can fall into. And it is important to say that there is some truth in those misunderstandings, but thankfully our God is neither of those oversimplified characters. He is so much more. He is complex, and actually he's not like us. He's not human, he is God. And often in the Bible, God is described as holy. And what we mean by the word holy, just to unpack that a little bit, is it means someone who is perfect, who is free from any guilt or sin. And it's sometimes referred to as righteousness. So that's what we think of when we think of God. He is holy, he is other. And it is so important that we don't put God into a box or make him smaller and oversimplify him just so we can wrap our heads around him or kind of understand him. So how do we really answer this question of what is God like? And how do we avoid kind of misunderstanding the complexities and actually really getting to the heart of who he is and what his character is like? Well, the good news is God has given us his word, and those amazing passages that Phoebe has read today, I think, really explain some of that complexity to us and help us understand his true nature better. So hopefully I'm going to be able to unpack a little bit of that over the next few moments. So there's kind of two truths about God's character that I want to focus on today. And truth number one is God is separate from us in his holiness. But truth number two, he is so close to us in his deep, unending love. Maybe at first glance, we see those two statements and they seem to maybe contradict each other a little bit. How can God be loving and call us into relationship with himself and yet be so holy that people can't even approach him without facing death? I'm not going to lie, when Jim asked me to speak on these passages, a little bit stressful. I've spent a lot of my preparation, you just talk to Sam, and he'll tell you a lot of my preparation has been with my head in my hands thinking, how on earth am I going to unpack this in 20 to 30 minutes? So I did the only sensible thing you can do in a situation when you don't know the answer to a question, which is copy off a mate. So that's what I decided to go for. And in this instance, my mate is C.S. Lewis. So I realize I'm stretching the use of the word mate here to breaking point. But just work with me, people. Just go with me. So most of you probably know that C.S. Lewis was a Christian author and theologian. And he wrote many books, including the kind of famous series, the Chronicles of Narnia. And as with most of his writing, the Chronicles of Narnia are very influenced by Lewis's Christian faith. So there's a lot of parallels in the stories to actually the biblical story, and they really beautifully unpack that in lots of ways. And in the books, one of the main characters is called Aslan. And through Lewis's writing, he uses Aslan to represent Jesus, who is the image of the invisible God. So actually, when we look at Jesus, he helps us understand something about God's character. So I'm just going to pause here for a second for some audience interaction, because who doesn't love some audience interaction in your Sunday morning preach? Yeah? Okay, one person, that's good. I can see fear in some of your eyes. Some of you are thinking, this is not what I signed up for. I just came here to sit and chill, but I promise it will be over soon, and then you can go back to thinking about what you're going to have for lunch. So it's not going to be a big segment of the preach. So what I'm going to do is, somewhere hidden on my person, I have a prize which I'm going to give to someone in the audience here today. And that is going to go to the person who can answer my question correctly. So the way I'm going to judge it is it's just going to be first person to put your hand in the air. So I don't want any shouting out or you've got to keep the answer to yourself until I pick you and you put your hand up. So are you guys ready for my question? Oh, I love that. Brilliant. So here comes the question. Can anybody tell me what kind of animal Aslan is? Oh, look at that, absolutely smashed. That was so confident. It was straight in the air. Okay, and what I've got as my prize, guys, it's a lion bar. Do you see what I did there? You see what I did? So here we go. Let's give a clap to the winner. There we go, beautiful. I felt a bit like a game show host there. That was very nice. Brilliant. So yes, that was just a little bit of audience interaction for you there. So now we're all clear. Aslan is the lion. He's a character from the Chronicles of Narnia who represents Jesus, the image of the invisible God. I do promise this is going somewhere. Just stay with me. So there's a scene in one of the books in the Narnia series where a character called Mr. Beaver, I think it's a bit easier to guess what kind of animal he is explaining who Aslan is to one of the human characters, Susan, who has just entered the realm of Narnia. And when I was thinking about this idea that God is so holy that the Israelites rightly feared him, and yet he is loving and good, this quote from that conversation in the book came into my head. So I think it really helpfully unpacks some of the complexity and the wonder of God's character displayed in the passages that we're going to unpack a bit more today. So I'm just going to read that quote to you now. So Mr. Beaver says, Aslan is a lion, the great lion. Oh, said Susan. I thought he was a man. Is he quite safe? I should feel rather nervous about meeting a lion. Safe, said Mr. Beaver. Who said anything about safe? Of course he isn't safe, but he's good. He's the king, I tell you. Of course he isn't safe, but he is good. He's the king, I tell you. This quote is telling us something about the character of Jesus, and as I mentioned earlier, Jesus is the image of the invisible God that we read about in these passages in Exodus. So actually we understand who God is through what Jesus looks like. He is not safe, but he is good. To unpack this a little bit more, I want you to do a little bit of imagination with me this morning. So I want you to imagine yourselves walking through a dangerous jungle. Maybe it's dark, you're by yourself, maybe somewhere like the Amazon rainforest. So you're thinking about the creatures that you might encounter in this kind of dangerous jungle that you're walking through. And I want you to think about how you might be feeling in that situation. I know for me, I would definitely be feeling fearful, probably anxious, maybe overwhelmed. I'd be thinking about what creatures I might be, running into, the dangers that they could pose me. But now I want you to imagine the same scene, but this time you are riding through that jungle on the back of a great lion. And as you pass through the dangerous jungle, kind of ask yourself that same question again. How might you be feeling? And actually, what is left to fear if you're riding through that jungle on the back of the lion? Only the lion, right? I think our world often feels like a dangerous jungle. But when we know we are with the lion, there is nothing else to fear. In the same way, we have a mighty and powerful and sometimes frightening God. And when we have an awareness of his greatness and power and perfectness, actually that rightly leads us to a place of healthy fear. But alongside that, God, the mighty lion, loves us so much that he sent his one and only Son to take on our sin, the sin that separates us from this holy God. And he died in our place so that we can approach God and have a relationship with him. That actually we can know a God who calls us his treasured possession, who carries us like a protective mother eagle on wings. This is the complex, amazing God that we serve. It's just those 2 points again. God is separate from us in his utter holiness, but he is so close to us in his deep, unending love. And actually, I think we see this in the passage in the two ways that God speaks to his people, and that's what I'm just going to talk a little bit more about for the next few moments. So way number one, we see that God reveals himself through a terrifying display of visual power. In chapters 19, verse 16 to 19, we read this. On the morning of the third day, there was thunder and lightning with a thick cloud over the mountain and a very loud trumpet blast. Everyone in the camp trembled. Then Moses led the people out of the camp to meet with God, and they stood at the foot of the mountain. Mount Sinai was covered with smoke because the Lord descended on it in fire. The smoke billowed up from it like smoke from a furnace, and the whole mountain trembled violently. As the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder, Moses spoke, and the voice of God answered him. So from what we've just read, here's the ways that we see that God is revealing himself to the Israelites. So he's revealing himself through thunder and lightning, thick cloud, loud trumpet blast. He makes the mountains tremble, and he descends in fire and smoke. Now, I think we can probably all remember a time maybe when we have seen the power of nature and actually how terrifying that can be. It might be through a thunderstorm, or I don't know if you've ever been down to Brighton Beach, kind of in the middle of a storm, and looked out at the waves and just kind of how choppy they are and actually quite scary looking out at them. And I know when I've done that, when I've gone down to the seafront and kind of looked out when it's been like that, what it immediately kind of makes me feel is it conjures this sense of kind of awe, but also respect for the power of the water. And actually a healthy fear, in some ways, of its might, that I recognize the danger that it could pose me if I didn't treat it with respect and didn't actually understand who I am in relation to the power of the water. And I think it's interesting that people often have a very deep connection with the sea. You talk to certain people and they have that kind of, deep connection. But actually a phrase you'll often hear them say is that you have to respect the water as well, because they have an understanding of where they stand in relation to its power. And I think this is what we see of God revealing himself to the Israelites in the story, that they are experiencing the God who is holy, who is powerful, who is mighty. And their response actually is wisely a healthy fear and respect. In chapter 20, verse 18, it says, "When the people saw the thunder and lightning and heard the trumpet and saw the mountain in smoke, they trembled with fear. They stayed at a distance and said to Moses, 'Speak to us yourself and we will listen, but do not have God speak to us or we will die.'" A bit like me when I look at the waves during a storm, their response is a healthy understanding of, and wariness actually, of the power and might of what they're experiencing, which in this case is the living God, the holy God and his presence. So that's way number one that we see God speaking in this passage. And we see his character being revealed, that he is separate from us in his holiness, and his power and might command fear and respect. But in contrast, we also see that God calls Moses personally and speaks to him intimately. I'm just going to quickly run through some examples of this kind of conversation that Moses has with God in the passage. So in chapter 19, verse 3, it says, "The Lord called on him, Moses, from the mountain and said." In verse 9, it says, "The Lord said to Moses." In verse 10, "And the Lord said to Moses." Verse 19, "Moses spoke and the Lord answered him." Verse 20 and 21, "So Moses went up and God answered him. Moses said to the Lord and the Lord replied." What we see here is Moses and God having this intimate conversation. And actually later on in the book of Exodus, in chapter 33, verse 11, it says this, "Thus the Lord would speak to Moses face to face as a man speaks to a friend." Isn't that amazing? We have a God who is mighty and powerful and holy and can make mountains and nations tremble, and yet Moses spoke to him like a friend. And actually, because of what Jesus has done on the cross, through his death and resurrection, we can also know God as a friend. The passage also uses this really beautiful language that we touched on earlier. In chapters 19, verse 4 to 5, God speaks a reminder of his loving care for Israel, and actually the loving care that caused him to carry them out of their oppression and slavery on wings like eagles. And actually, he calls them out of all the nations that they will be his treasured possession. And I love that we see this reiterated in other parts of the Bible. So, like, for example, in Deuteronomy 7, verse 7, God says this about Israel. He says that he did not set his affection on Israel or choose them because they were more numerous than other nations. Actually, they were the fewest of all peoples. But the Lord chose them because he loved them. The Lord chose them because he loved them. God is separate from us in his utter holiness, but he is so close to us in his deep, unending love. God is not a one-dimensional God. Church, we serve a mighty God. Isn't that so good to remember? I think especially in the world that we live in, we look around and we see not only things like the crisis in Ukraine, but, in Syria, in Yemen, Ethiopia, we look at our own lives and some of the challenges that we face. I don't know about you, but I can often feel powerless, overwhelmed, under-equipped. But we can call on our God who is mighty. It's so important to remember that. God is not a small God. And yet he also calls his people his treasured possession. He chooses us because he loves us. And because of what Jesus has done on the cross, Jesus has made a way for us to be like Moses, to speak to God as a friend. Our God is complex. He is not safe, but he is good. I think it's so important that we don't shy away from that complexity just to make God more kind of palatable or understandable. Because actually how we view God will shape everything else in our lives. He is mighty. He is in control. He can make mountains and nations tremble. And actually when we fear him, there is nothing else that we need to fear. Isn't that good news? And yet his love is so vast that he sent his one and only Son so that we can be called his treasured possession. Church, this passage has so much that we can unpack, but actually I just wanted to keep it really simple for us today, and that's what I want you to take away, that God is not simple, he is complex. And I'm going to unpack, I'm just going to give us a little bit more time to respond in a second. But what I would love us to do is actually just respond in worship now. Yeah, let's just take a moment to just be in God's presence. In a moment, we are going to worship a bit more, but I just There's a few more things I just wanted to quickly share as we respond. Actually, maybe today you need to know a deeper, or maybe even a first-time understanding of this God who is holy, as we've just been singing. And as I was preparing, there are a few just really simple things that I wanted to share with you that I think can really help us. I think sometimes practical things can be so helpful to think about how can we honour this God that is holy. So two of the things that I found really helpful were, something as simple as how we address God can make a huge difference. Using words like Holy Father to start our prayers can be really helpful because it encapsulates this idea that God is holy, he is separate. We have to come in awe and reverence, and yet we can call him Father. Or maybe as we're praying and reflecting in this time, sometimes our posture can be helpful as well. You might want to, put your hands out or, even kind of bowing down on your knees to recognize that actually we are, we're bowing down before a God who is holy. That can really help us prepare our hearts to meet with him. Maybe today you need to know that God is a God of love. That he isn't angry with you. He isn't cruel. He isn't harsh. But he calls you his treasured possession, and he wants to welcome you with open, loving arms. Or maybe you need to know the truth that our God is mighty. I don't know what you're bringing to church this morning or what you're facing, but if our God is for us, then who can be against us? God is for you.